Hello, and welcome to the Book Conversation series that's part of the U.S. and the World Workshop at Syracuse University's Maxwell School. My name is Usama Khalil. I'm a professor of history at the Maxwell School and the coordinator of the workshop series. Our guest today is Stuart Schrader. He's an associate professor of Africana Studies and associate director of the program in Racism, Immigration, and Citizenship at Johns Hopkins University. He is the author of Badges Without Borders: How Global Counterinsurgency Transformed American Policing, which was published by the University of California Press in 2019. And he has also been published widely, including in the New Republic, the Washington Post, Viewpoint Magazine, and the NACLA Report on the Americas. Stuart, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, it's wonderful to have you. I'm going to hold up a cover of your book, which I love, and hopefully others will pick it up as well. It's really a wonderful examination, not just of counterinsurgency, but really of American empire. And so I want to thank you first for writing it, and thank you again for coming on. One of the goals of the workshop series, especially for first-time authors, is I like to present this as a way for grad students to get an idea as they're working through their projects. How do you come up with a project idea? How does it become a dissertation, then a dissertation to a book? So I was wondering if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about the process. How did this idea come to you for this project? What was the gotcha moment, if you will?
Yeah, it's a great question. And maybe I can instill some confidence in your graduate students by saying that I had no idea that I would write this book when I started. And in many ways, even late into the process, I didn't know exactly what I was doing. When I applied to graduate school, I went to NYU in American Studies. When I applied, I proposed a project that was going to be more like an urban ethnography, a kind of case study of a fight about kind of gentrification, because that was what I was dealing with in my life. I was living in a neighborhood that was transforming. I was involved in some activism, and I had an interest in policing that both predated that and that experience of that gentrification struggle, but also it was the years of Mike Bloomberg's mayoralty. Stop and frisk was happening in New York City. So questions of policing were kind of unavoidable at the time, but also I felt like not really adequately addressed either among the generally, white activists who were opposed to the development that was happening, or really in the literature that I was aware of. And granted, I wasn't, super aware of all of the literature that was going on, but I still think that to a large degree, the literature on, gentrification and policing remain not adequately linked. But I also had this other funny thing in the back of my head, this kind of one line, more or less, that I had read in an article by a historian named Forrest Hilton, who mainly writes about Columbia, but he had written something about Brooklyn, and it, he said something that I think was like that the policing strategies being used in Brooklyn going back to the 70s, had been influenced by, I don't remember if he used the word counterinsurgency or the war in Vietnam or something like that. And that just, that stuck with me. I had also had another kind of just phrase that stuck in my head from college, a class with Bob Brigham, who's a historian of South Vietnam, and the US and South Vietnam. Really, it's like the one thing I really remember from a class in college very clearly, which was just, he had this idea that stuck with me, and I can't explain why, but it was just about how the Johnson administration was, I think the word he used at that time was, activist overseas and activist domestically. So that idea stuck in my head. So, on some level, all of these things kind of came together only through the kind of coursework and reading that I was doing, conversations primarily with my advisor, Nikhil Singh, conversation with Greg Grandin and a few other people at NYU, that led me to realize, okay, I could potentially do a project where I think about policing, I think about US empire, I think about connections between foreign and domestic policy. And I think really, I just didn't know how to go about doing research about foreign and domestic policy together. And there's no clear model for how to do it. And on some level, it's a kind of case by case basis, because the route through into the archives will dictate what one is able to do. And in my case, the one thing that I would say is that the dissertation proposal that I wrote, I don't think uses the words Office of Public Safety. I may have known about OPS just from reading it, reading mentions of it in the secondary literature, but I didn't think that the book would center on OPS. And in fact, the dissertation focuses or centers less on OPS than I think the book actually does. And at some point, I just kind of threw up my hands and said, you know what, I kind of have to trim some of these branches that are going in other directions and hew a bit more closely to OPS. But of course, I'm happy with how it turned out, being this kind of book where OPS is both the kind of vehicle for the story I'm telling about foreign and domestic policy coming to be interlinked, but also, it's not just a narrative device. So it's actually true that was the case, but it doesn't mean that OPS by any means is the only object of study that I could have looked at to do this kind of work. But in the case of policing and counterinsurgency, it was the right one.
But what archives and sources did you use? And you mentioned how this was a challenge, often coming from both domestic and foreign approaches. And were some of them used for the first time, or did you find yourself looking at something in a new way?
Yeah, I definitely think I was not a trailblazer in terms of discovering new archives. In some ways, I used very predictable archives, although some papers that became very important to me had not yet been released while I was doing my research. So the first time I went to the LBJ library, which again, lots and lots of researchers have gone there. But while I was there the first time, I looked at some papers of Robert Comer, and then maybe the second or third time, I can't remember, I returned. The archivist was like, guess what? We just released a whole set of new papers of Robert Comer. So I think, I'm not totally positive about this, but I think that some of the records that I used in Comer's files, nobody had really used before or cited before. That said, they're not necessarily, they don't necessarily tell us too much that I think couldn't have already figured out from other sources. Because one thing about the LBJ library is that administration filed many, many copies of many documents. So oftentimes I would find things in multiple places. And that actually leads to, in a sense, some of the method, which was really about, if I was trying to think about foreign and domestic together, the light bulb that went off for me, as you mentioned, was noticing certain names of individuals or moments or phrases or ideas in multiple places. Sometimes there would be a name, say, Byron Engel or Arnold Sagman, people who I wrote about quite a lot. Again, I went into the archive not knowing who they were, but then their names appeared in the foreign files and the domestic files, or in the Kerner Commission files and the National Security Council files. And so it was that, noticing that, and or similarly, I talk about this in the book. Language like that puts Saigon and Newark side by side, or something along those lines. And in many ways, I kind of wish that I had made a sort of appendix to the book where I just cataloged all of these mentions. It was just something that I never quite did. But there were more than I could have even mentioned in the book, even as I probably mentioned more than I needed to get the point across. So that was in some way a very accidental kind of happenstance methodology, where it was just like, all right, here are two places on the globe or on the planet that are represented by different archival collections that are training and our kind of political imaginary treats as separate. And yet there are these figures who are in between or going across them. So how do I make sense of that? And that was what led me to just kind of follow these people. And, and I have to say that some of this stuff I was able to do in ways that I think text searchable files pre-Google would have been really, really challenging. I mean, for example, nowadays, when you come across a name that you've not encountered before in the LBJ library archives, you can just type it into Google and find out who that person is. So, and I did that with Arnold Sagman. And then I found out, oh, his papers are collected at American University. And so then I was able to eventually go to American University and look at the papers he had deposited there. And, and also just, again, doing a kind of search in various texts for people's names. That doesn't always work, but I do think, I haven't necessarily fully articulated in my own head how my work is different because of these tools. But I think that in general, I would say that a lot of scholarship that's coming out now is really being transformed in ways that we haven't fully grasped based on these tools. And I think it does open up new possibilities. Again, it's not that one wouldn't necessarily have had the impulse to deploy the kind of methodology that I deployed in the 1990s or 1980s. It's that the possibilities of figuring out some of these connections have grown. Still, that said, I did a lot of quite analog research at the same time. Just the last thing I would say, I think I went to something like 22 archives in the US and UK, ranging from the National Archives and the Presidential Libraries to, small town historical society. And that was in Walnut Creek, which is a kind of rich town in California, actually, which had a kind of intense experience in the uprisings after George Floyd was killed that I took note of. But Walnut Creek, there's this line in a document that has been quoted a number of times in the kind of annals of the history of the Office of Public Safety. There's this line that, I think it was maybe in an oral history or something from a public safety advisor who said, he was basically trying to say, look, we didn't have the competence to do the work of transforming police forces in other countries. Our officers or our advisors were officers in, places like Walnut Creek, which at the time was this kind of, in the 50s and 60s, kind of rural, it's over the mountains from the Bay Area, kind of toward the Central Valley. Now it's a very rich, Bay Area town, but back then it was this kind of small, sleepy town. So, I was like, all right, I'm going to go to Walnut Creek and try to figure this out. And in fact, it was true that a cluster of public safety advisors did come from Walnut Creek. They, I think, went mainly to South Vietnam. But what I found, as I wrote in the book, is that a number of these guys already had experience in counterinsurgency prior to becoming cops in Walnut Creek, right? They had been, in kind of special forces or something along those. I don't remember the exact details now. And so I kind of say like, well, this struck me that to rethink policing, small town policing in the United States, it's like these guys have these itineraries where they're many of them are veterans of the military in World War II or Korea. They become cops for a number of years. They retire because maybe it's just kind of boring in Walnut Creek. They go to South Vietnam. Meanwhile, Walnut Creek, there's some like, new left radical group that's trying to bomb the Walnut Creek police station in the late 60s. So it became necessary, I think, for me to really like have a much more expanded vision of who these people are, where they're going, and then how to document that using the archives that were available, and what kind of reading practices to use in order to make sense of this. And it just meant trying to keep track of a lot of things simultaneously, a lot of moving parts. So.
As we're often told as grad students, the best dissertation is the one that's finished. There's no such thing as a perfect dissertation. And then, of course, there's the other aspect of it as you're preparing for your defense of it'll go in the book. It'll go in the book, right? So, how did you start to reconceptualize this as you were thinking about it as a book? And that's hard. It's not an easy process, especially because you have a lot of moving parts coming in, and you already hinted at one, which is, you didn't expect OPS to be the center of this, and you have these really interesting figures that hopefully we'll talk about in a bit that are coming in and out. How did you start to rethink this as a book project rather than a dissertation?
Yeah. Well, on the one hand, I would say that I started out, in the dissertation writing process, trying for whatever it was worth, trying to think of it as book-like, meaning that, for example, the chapters focused individually on Engel, Sagman, and Comer. Those chapters did exist in the dissertation, and they exist in the book. But many other things changed. I subtracted some chapters, I added some chapters. I think I subtracted 2, and then I think I added 3. So, and I rewrote the introduction a million times. After maybe for about a year after finishing the dissertation, I didn't really go back to it. I kind of left it aside, and it was hard to let go of some of the thinking, but I also did more research, and that also changed a number of things, including expanding the kind of temporal scope. I tended to think, this may not have been totally accurate, but I tended to think of the dissertation as going from the beginning of the Kennedy administration, meaning 1961, to 1974, 1975, when the Office of Public Safety is shut down. I think the book, the periodization is it would be more accurate to say is really 1945 to 1975. So I think the focus still remains on that shorter period of about 15 years of the 60s into the mid 70s. But a lot does actually happen in the 40s and 50s that's germane to the analysis. And so I do think of the periodization as a bit more expanded than it was in the dissertation. And I spent a lot of time trying to think about what was necessary and what I could leave out and could potentially stand on its own. So one of the chapters that came out that was in the dissertation and wasn't in the book ended up becoming a journal article, and maybe a few pages of the book, 2 or 3 pages, kind of reference that argument that is done much more expansively in the article. And then I have this other chapter that I'm still trying to figure out what to do with, that maybe will be an article, or maybe, I don't know, maybe it'll be a pamphlet that
or another book, right? Maybe it'll be another book. You never know.
Yeah.
If it's okay, I thought we could turn more towards the book. Now, you hinted at some of this already, which is, and I think what one of the things I love about the book is, and you're very clear about this in the beginning, you mentioned already, that it sits at the intersection of domestic and foreign policy. And you're very clear, you write that these realms are, quote, contested outcomes of social, political, and economic processes. So in your telling, how does policing cross this artificial boundary of foreign and domestic that we've been told over and over again exists?
Yeah. I think it's in a number of ways. One is in the kind of at the level of, I don't know, most political theory, which is really when we try to define policing or the police power. Many theorists have argued that going back to the kind of inception of the concept of police at the kind of dawn of capitalism and potentially even earlier, that it's characterized by a defining undefinability. It's limitless. So I think that as soon as we try to grapple with a kind of power that is limitless in scope, it invites us to think about limitlessness in terms of geography. So already I was kind of inclined, after having done some of this reading, figures like Mark Neoclaus and Marcus Dirk Dubber, there's a number of theorists who are quite important for me, and I know other scholars who I'm in dialogue with, that really helped me to think about police in a different way from just our kind of traditional definition of the guy with the badge and the gun and so forth, and the uniform. However, on some level, the argument of the book is like, okay, even if we have this expanded definition of police, which may be both kind of limitless in terms of its discretionary power, it's also limitless geographically. Well, let's look at the individuals and institutions that we call police in our everyday speech, the guy in the uniform. Turns out they're also historically somewhat limitless in terms of the geography of US empire. So the Office of Public Safety is the police training arm of the US government. It exists from 1962 to 1974-75. It has some predecessor agencies earlier than 1962. And it trains police from 77 countries around the globe, mainly in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And it introduces advisory missions in 52 countries. And some of those advisory missions are quite large. The largest is in South Vietnam. South Vietnam is the largest in so many categories in this period of time. And some are quite small, really just a couple advisors for a couple years. But in many cases, they do actually last for a long time. Guatemala, I think it lasts, the mission there lasts for over 20 years. And a few other places, they're quite long lasting, durable, and have I think quite profound effects on the security situations in those countries. So the Office of Public Safety was never a huge operation. It kind of peaked with around 400 advisors, but many of these advisors did travel from one country to the next. They would travel either regionally, particularly if they had language skills. They would travel to say countries across Latin America if they spoke Spanish. If they spoke French, they might end up in Francophone Africa as well as Southeast Asia. And it made me, once I was kind of realized this, it made me just kind of think of police as very different from the way that police officers and police agencies tend to narrate themselves. I mean, the discourse of policing, and so much of this is bound up in the kind of dismantling of Jim Crow and the civil rights movement and federal action on civil rights. So much of the discourse of policing in this period is about the local, the small scale, the prerogative of the chief, and the prerogative of the officer on the beat. So that language, suffuses police, even as many of these guys are operating, globally, and they're very consciously trying to forge connections with officers from other countries. And so again, this is somebody I wrote about more in the dissertation than in the book. There's a guy called Homer Garrison, who was the leader of the Texas Department of Public Safety, which basically means he was like in charge of the Texas Rangers from, I think, the 40s through the 50s. And he's a guy who is very sensitive to how civil rights law is going to potentially transform policing on a local scale. And he has a very interesting set of ideas about this that I should probably, actually write up and publish. But on the one hand, he's obsessed with the keeping the local realm impermeable, on some level, so that there isn't too much federal encroachment. On the other hand, he's constantly saying, to kind of assert his authority and his importance to the world of law enforcement, he's constantly saying, I have long supported, the global mission of police. I have favored U.S. support for law enforcement officers in country XYZ. So that seems like a little bit of a paradox. But I think on some level, the thrust of the argument of the book is that this actually isn't a paradox that we should stumble over. It's a paradox that we should really delve into, and getting at the heart of that paradox is the way to understand the police power and also the police institution itself, despite its claims to localism.
That's great. And it's interesting because what so struck me about the book when you were describing these realms and the role of policing is, someone like Teddy Roosevelt was so upfront about it, right? I mean, there's the idea of the cop on the beat. And, so he takes that idea as the, New York City police commissioner, and he applies it, to foreign policy, especially in the Western Hemisphere. And it's infused. And it's interesting to me how often, that mentality and that approach is then, it's applied in the Philippines. We see it applied again, during World War II, especially in the occupation areas, again in Korea. And so I think what's great about the book is that it draws on many of these examples, as well as, of course, Jim Crow, which is our transition here to this next question, because I think what's really remarkable about the book is, you situate this as a story about American empire. You're very clear about that. It's also a story about capitalism, and it's a story about racism. And in that, those three come together. And in your telling, as I see it, that the United States is not only an empire, right, but a counter-revolutionary power. And I'm curious if you want to explore that a little bit. I mean, you do in your intros, you talk about, for example, the role of the Black Panthers.
Yeah. Well, thank you. You've put it quite well. I would say that we don't have, to my mind, and this is certainly not to disparage the scholars who are doing this, but I still think we don't really have a full enough account of the way that a figure like Teddy Roosevelt and his discourse of the necessity of a global police power and the kind of arrogation by U.S. leaders through a mission of empire and colonialism, how that gets routed into just what becomes the common sense understanding of U.S. power on the globe, and many of the and also infuses basic categories or of international relations, like realism, for example. The kind of worry about containing anarchy, on some level, like how do police understand themselves, to this day, to September 13th, 2021? How do they understand themselves except as, of course, the thin blue line between civilization and anarchy? Teddy Roosevelt, could open up Twitter today and not be at all confused about what's happening in the world. I think he would understand it perfectly, and find he would probably be quite happy to know that his rhetoric is still alive in many ways, and his vision of U.S. global power. And of course, so much of the debate that we're living through right now about Afghanistan rehashes much of this. And I really think that the kind of racist idiom that was, barely veiled or not really veiled at all in somebody like Roosevelt is also barely veiled today, and I think it takes a great amount of denialism to pretend like that's not what's happening. And of course, we have recourse to terms like idealism and realism to help us pretend that we're not talking about race on a global scale, but guess what? We are, and that's kind of the fundamental principle that the book is trying to engage with. Because again, the paradox that I think we need to sit with is that on the one hand, I don't think anybody would be surprised for me to say that these policing experts of the 40s, 50s, and 60s are coming out of a world of Jim Crow. They're coming out of a pre-civil rights era United States, where police are, of course, charged with enforcing the color line. Everybody, I think, kind of on some level gets that. On the other hand, when you read what they say about what they're trying to do, they actually go out of their way to try not to seem like they're there to enforce the color line. Now, one way to deal with this would be to say, well, what they say is what they write down and what gets kept in the archives is the sanitized version. And I think there's something to that. I also think there's one could potentially talk about hypocrisy or something like that. But I think actually it's a little bit more complicated, and I try to explain this in the book. And in some ways, it's the most challenging part of the book for me to kind of talk about, because it's an intricate argument. But the point really is just to say that, like, U.S. empire is both rehashing the old civilizing mission that other empires are doing, and at the same time is trying to avoid being those other empires. It's trying to avoid being the British or the French, etc. So it adopts tones and terms of racial liberalism, even as it is quite certain that what that racial liberalism will look like is everybody around the globe, regardless of their, religion and their culture and their, food preferences and so forth. Well, they're going to adhere to the fundamentally U.S. designs for a capitalist global economy. And fundamentally, they're going to accede to U.S. power, which might mean, basing and other types of kind of hard power. And they're going to help eliminate their domestic communist movements, which is always already an international movement, right? So those are the three kind of key pieces. And again, police play an important role in this, because the whole kind of security picture is at risk of falling apart if the police in these individual countries aren't on board and aren't up to the task, and primarily the task of snuffing out a radical left.
Right. So, one of the aspects of the book, it just jumped right out at me that I loved, was how you deal with the Kerner Commission report and how it infuses through the book, right? And in part because it's been so widely discussed, you could say, over the past 5 to 7 years. And often seen as the warning of that was missed about militarized policing and systemic racism. And yet, what I really appreciated about your book was you found a different meaning in the report and an unintended consequence that comes out. And so, what was it? What was the Kerner Commission report? What was the context that comes out? And as you see it in your story, what were its implications?
Yeah. My copy is sitting here on the shelf and it's falling apart. and there's a brand new version of it, which is abridged, edited by Jelani Cobb and Matthew Gloriglia. And I think it's great that the Kerner Commission report remains a kind of fundamental text that people return to. But it's got some problems. I mean, one of the problems was even just the kind of analysis that it provides, which I think many people across the political spectrum, I think, still find really powerful. I think it's important to note that, it could have been potentially even more a little bit left-wing than it was in some of the more left-wing analyses, including by a Johns Hopkins University graduate student. Those were deleted, but that has also been republished as called "The Harvest of American Racism." That report. Anyway, point is, what does the Kerner Commission say? It says, look, the cause of the unrest in 1967 in Newark, Detroit, and many other cities is poverty, is racism, is inequality in terms of housing, education, healthcare. And therefore, to ameliorate this, the United States should spend a huge amount of money to fix these inequalities. Now, the Kerner Commission report does note that almost every incident of what they call civil disorders in 1967 is touched off by an incident of police either brutality or kind of rumors of police brutality, right? So they say they're a little bit reluctant. I mean, it's a nuanced and complicated document, so I don't want to overly generalize. And I sometimes I think it's so hard to summarize a text like the Kerner Commission report because there's so much going on in it. But so they do acknowledge that these incidents occur, but they don't really say therefore policing on the whole needs to be transformed, because they really say, look, the underlying causes are poverty and racism. That's what needs to be transformed. However, most people who read the Kerner Commission report read the quite compelling case studies and aggregation of data and so forth, and then they skip the last quarter or third of the text, which is the supplement on control of disorders. So they are quite explicit and very detailed about how to deal with the imminent threat of a civil disorder, and once a civil disorder breaks out, how to deal with it once it breaks out. Now, famously, when the Kerner Commission report comes out, Lyndon Johnson has just recently said he's not going to run for re-election. He has really no interest in going to Congress. I think he kind of knows it's unlikely that Congress will move on it. No interest in going and saying, hey, this group of commissioners that I hired to figure out this problem that we have, they say, let's spend billions upon billions of dollars to fix this problem. So he doesn't even really acknowledge the Kerner Commission report publication. It gets put on his desk. I think he has to sign a piece of paper, and within 2 weeks or something, I can't remember the exact story, but it's basically, at 11:59 on the last day, he says, yes, I received this report. And then he kind of doesn't mention it again. Meanwhile, it's become a bestseller. It's in paperback edition. It's being handed out on the streets of the cities of the United States. So no investment in solving poverty, but the report comes out, I think on February 29th, because it's a leap year in 1968. And already in December, the Department of Justice, the Army, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, and other law enforcement experts have started getting together and totally revamping what they're calling riot control training across the country. This leads to a number of big conferences that are held, I think, at a building in Virginia. So they bring police from around the country to these sessions. Maybe they take some of it on the road. The FBI is also doing its own thing. So, we generally talk about the Kerner Commission report as this report that has this great analysis that led to no tangible, social impact. But that's only true if we leave out the supplement on control of disorders, because actually the tangible impact is twofold. One, this training, which I analyze, in one of the chapters, which actually continues for quite some time into the 70s under the auspices of the U.S. Army, but also the investment which comes about as a result of the signing of the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act in 1968, which creates a massive new federal bureaucracy to funnel money and resources and expertise to law enforcement around the country. So in the first year of that bureaucracy's existence, which is called the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, the LEAA, a huge chunk of its money is spent on riot control technologies, which basically means, helmets, batons, and tear gas. Now, a lot of it doesn't necessarily get used because the really large outbreak of unrest happens in April '68, which is before the bill gets signed, and arguably the bill gets signed passed in Congress because of the April '68 uprisings around the country after King is assassinated, and then Robert Kennedy's assassination. But there's a huge expenditure on riot control gear, and just the last point about this is that the focus on tear gas in the expenditure is, I argue, directly the result of who is on the Kerner Commission, or not on the commission itself, but on the staff. It's this guy, Arnold Sagman. Arnold Sagman's best friend, or not best friend, but close friend, whom he invites to testify before the Kerner Commission, is the director of the Office of Public Safety, Byron Engel, who in his testimony says the way to fix, or not fix, but the way to lessen the severity of civil disorders is to use tear gas. We are doing this with the Office of Public Safety in many countries around the globe. We've had great success doing this. And this is my recommendation. And guess what? It's basically quoted verbatim in that supplement at the end of the report.
Well, that's great. So let's, if we can, you've mentioned both of these individuals a couple of times. So we have Byron Engel and we have Arnold Sagman. Can you talk a little bit more about who they were, their friends?
Yeah.
What's great is that you brought them back into history in a way, right? I mean, these are kind of individuals who, as you mentioned, you see them in documents throughout, but have often been overlooked. And so I'm curious if you can kind of, as you dig into it, how, who were they and how much did you learn about them? You went to look through Sagman's papers. You mentioned it, American.
Yeah. Well, so, I certainly did not think of myself as writing in a biographical mode, but on some level, I just kind of got really interested in figuring out these individuals. So Robert Comer is the third individual who I spend the most time on, and he has a number of papers, although not really personal papers. There's only, I mention it in the book, that he leaves behind a very small amount of personal papers. And I think he might have maybe written something akin to a memoir that is held by Rand Corporation, but I've never seen. There is a biography of him that another scholar wrote. But Engel, similarly, no personal papers left behind. Right. Sagman wrote a memoir, kind of self-published memoir, and left behind personal and professional papers. So it was in part just like this kind of mystery that I just wanted to solve for my own purposes, which is exactly as you say, who are these people, and why do they, keep coming up, and why was it that Byron Engel ends up testifying before the Kerner Commission? I should just say, Arnold Sagman calls his kind of outfit within the Kerner Commission's massive kind of investigative bureaucracy. He calls it the Office of Public Safety, right? So it's a clear nod to what the U.S. is doing overseas. So Byron Engel, he is a police officer from Kansas City. He becomes a police officer. Many police officers, it's the kind of family tradition. Your granddad, your dad, your uncle, whoever is a cop. That was not true for Engel. He was just he describes himself as a country boy, grew up in a rural part of the state, eventually moves to Kansas City and becomes a cop. And honestly, it's still a little bit of a mystery to me, but he's just a whiz at police training. So, what that means exactly in practice is not necessarily quite as important as the reputation he developed in the region, Kansas City and other cities of the Midwest, as this kind of expert at police training, and particularly at riot control training. So World War II happens. There's one piece that I should mention before World War II. So when Engel becomes a cop, it's at a period of massive reform of the police department in Kansas City. The old political machine has come apart. It collapses. Harry Truman is part of this story as well, which I emphasize in the book. So Engel comes in this reform moment. The new police chief in Kansas City is an acolyte of J. Edgar Hoover. He has Engel go to the FBI Academy, which is crucial. I mean, basically, there's no way that Engel could have kind of ascended in the way he did without having attended the FBI Academy, even though he ultimately becomes the creature of the CIA, and FBI, CIA divisions are an endemic feature of basically the history of the United States since 1947, when we're talking about national security and law enforcement. But I like to say that Engel managed to be friendly with, or on good professional terms with, people from all of these different agencies, from FBI to CIA to local police forces around the United States. So he had this kind of demeanor or kind of acumen at negotiating kind of bureaucratic rivalries, which enabled him to succeed. And so what happens is World War II ends, he stays home, he keeps being a cop. World War II ends, the US occupies Japan and Germany and some other places, and starts rebuilding the police forces in those places, because it's believed that the only way to prevent the rise of another kind of dictatorial regime is to develop US-style police forces. Now, the police forces in many cities in the United States, perhaps even including Kansas City, were basically dictatorial at the time. What they mean by that is that the central government shouldn't control the police forces. So Washington, D.C. does not control the perhaps otherwise dictatorial police force in Kansas City. It's completely under its own authority. The federal system looms large here. So Engel goes to Japan to introduce a bunch of police reforms. And I think it's crucial that he, Sagman, and other figures I look at kind of come up in this moment of reform and kind of transformation of police departments around the country. And I think they believe that in the same way that the political machines that control these cities, such as Kansas City, have been removed, and the police force has kind of emerged stronger on the other side in many ways, more technically capable, more politically legitimate, they hope. I think they think the same thing is true in these other countries. And I would argue that they're not the same, but my analysis is not really of kind of political development, comparative political development of different regimes. It's about what these police experts think they're trying to do in these other countries, and they think they're trying to replicate the experiences they've had. So just to say a couple words on Sagman. So Sagman is not himself, doesn't have a kind of similar trajectory in terms of being a police officer and so forth. I mean, he has intimate ties to policing, but he becomes a journalist. And so he's kind of in this intermediary set of institutions of having worked in law enforcement, but not as a beat cop, worked in journalism. So he kind of maintained some connections with important figures in the world of law enforcement as a journalist. And then when the Kennedy administration comes into power, he applies for a job in law enforcement again, and it's because at the federal level, and it's because he has had this experience of police reform earlier in his life that I think helps him to make the case for himself as a federal law enforcement officer who will oversee training and coordination and so forth. And he meets Engel. He hasn't, so they've been living parallel lives for decades. And they meet each other in the 1960s. And Engel, I think, he just took a shine to Saglan. I think there's a little bit of cynicism there because I think he thought he could use Saglan, but Saglan, I think, definitely looked up to him. And then they start kind of working together over the ensuing decade or so.
So this is a really good transition to, you have this wonderful line that you get from CIA Director Alan Dulles. This is Ike's CIA director, who refers to police as, quote, the first line of defense. And this becomes the rationale for the Office of Public Safety, for OPS. And connected to that is this another great line you have from one of the overseas advisors who says, everywhere you go, a cop is a cop.
Yeah.
So you've got Engel, you've got Saglan, you've got the history of policing, domestic policing in places like Kansas City, informing what's being done in Japan. So how did now the U.S. envision the role of police as a counterinsurgency tool or as a counterinsurgency force?
Yeah. So, the line "a cop is a cop" again, I think is it's a cop version of racial liberalism, because they're really saying, like, whether you're Japanese, whether you're Korean, whether you're Mexican, the job of police is the same the world over. And what is the job? Well, I think that the job itself is to control space. And that is, again, where I think that Jim Crow fundamentally, I think, is in many ways about the control of space. And I think that continues to be what police do to this day. They control space. They control who can be in or not in certain zones of cities, who can move across borders. Border control looms large for the Office of Public Safety, and so on. So they tried to introduce reforms to police forces to get them to adopt a set of technologies that they think are crucial. Always, it's like it always comes back to crucial to identifying and ferreting out communist subversives. Now, they might have other purposes. Border control. Obviously, states rely on border control, and including, at that time, the actually existing communist states. I mean, I think on some level, like, for people like us who grew up while during the Cold War, our vision of the border is always kind of like, the Berlin Wall, or it's in movies that kind of represent a Soviet border crossing or whatever, whereas I think maybe people younger than us, our students, probably their vision of the border really is the US-Mexico border and its militarization. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about that, but anyway, point is that they might be trying to enhance border control that has value for collecting tariffs on and doing customs work and so forth, but really what they're worried about is that some guy is going to come across the border with guns, leaflets, other types of contraband that could potentially be useful for an insurgency. So, what I try to show in the book is that the policing techniques that the Office of Public Safety tries to instill, and the technologies, which are walkie-talkies, motorcycles, handcuffs. Engel introduces handcuffs, or Engel and his crew introduce handcuffs to Japan, where handcuffs weren't really common prior to the end of World War II. So these are all just basic technologies of policing. And they're all fundamentally about controlling the risk of communist insurgency. And I would just say that the way that this feeds into my analysis of counterinsurgency is that these folks, and particularly Robert Comer, who we can talk about, are convinced that insurgency, once it breaks out, guerrilla warfare, once it breaks out, is very, very hard to stop. And I think, history will bear that out. So counterinsurgency for them means keeping it from breaking out in the first place. And that's why policing is so important. That's why it means, stop and frisk, or, border control, collecting data on the households in neighborhoods. Does that, I mean, this became crucial during the US war in Vietnam. Is a household suddenly, does it suddenly have, something basic like more rice within the house than the family in the house could eat? Now, there might be good reasons for that, that have nothing to do with the National Liberation Front. But for the Office of Public Safety, they're training police, look for that. And that is an indicator that, somebody might be, worth taking a closer look at. And then what does a closer look at mean? Well, it probably means, arrest, jailing, torture, and who knows.
So you mentioned him several times, and he is a key figure in your story and counterinsurgency, and that's blowtorch Bob Comer. And you have this wonderful phrase where you describe him as a master of the national security state. So who was he, and why was he important to counterinsurgency efforts abroad and home? He's not a cop, but he really plays such a major role here in your story.
Yeah. Some of this, if anybody who's in control of releasing records at the CIA is watching, I would still like to see a few records about Comer's career in the late 1950s when he meets Byron Engel. I don't know, and I have not seen any records that attest to how they initially came into contact. But nevertheless, Comer becomes so Comer and Engel are both with the CIA during the Eisenhower years. Engel is doing his police training thing, traveling around the globe. Comer is really enamored of this police training program because he believes that it's a relatively not resource intensive way to contain communism. He is a believer in containment. Yeah. There are other figures who I would say at that moment in the Eisenhower administration who are greater believers in rollback of communism, right? So to put it kind of bluntly, those guys lose the bureaucratic battle and Comer wins. That's my argument. And the reason for that is that yes, from the perspective of the CIA, the Dulles brothers, et cetera, the coup in Guatemala goes swimmingly. They turn it into a kind of model for future covert action, and every covert action on that model subsequently kind of fails, right? There's also the Iran story, which bears mentioning, but so after the coup in Guatemala, a police assistance program is instituted. Same in Iran, but Comer, I think, believes that rollback is a tall order and is unlikely to succeed, whereas the police assistance programs to prevent, say, the rise of a figure who a coup might need to be, carried out in order to remove, that's a better approach, right?
Yeah.
The Bay of Pigs invasion happens early in the Kennedy administration in April of 1961, I believe, and it's a colossal failure. And a huge embarrassment to the United States. And people have been talking about it a lot lately because I think there's, historical analogs. People are looking for like, when has the US been so deeply embarrassed? Like we have to go back to the Bay of Pigs to understand Afghanistan. I don't think that's quite right. But anyway, Kennedy does some house cleaning at that point. He, figures who are associated with the Bay of Pigs invasion and that fiasco are pushed out. And on some level, it's not exactly true, but on some level, Comer's kind of the last man standing. He's untarnished by this. He's never been advocating for those types of operations. And he's been consistently advocating for the, basically safer, containment-oriented option of police assistance rather than the risky, potentially expensive option of, Black ops, or as they would have been called, these totally secret covert operations, cross-border infiltration, and so forth. And the cross-border infiltration is ongoing. It does continue, but it rarely has any success. And so Comer, he manages to have the ear of both John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. There's very few figures, as many presidential kind of biographies will tell you, there's very few figures, especially when it comes to foreign policy, who are trusted by both of those men. But Comer is one of them. I think it has a little bit to do with his kind of outsider status, right? Johnson doesn't fully trust all of Kennedy's guys because he sees them as these kind of patrician New England eggheads. Comer did go to Harvard, but he's Jewish. He's from the Midwest. So I think there's, some of those kind of, again, this is not really, what my work is about, but I do think it's relevant to pay attention to like some of these reasons why massive decisions about national security rest on interpersonal relationships and the kind of character of some of these individuals. And I think it's worth paying attention to because, of course, Comer and Dulles and, Dean Acheson and Paul Nitze, all these guys, they want US style capitalism to win. They want the US to win the Cold War. But we can't necessarily explain the outcomes if we remain at that level. So that's why I kind of delve into it. And I would just say, the last point, that's what's so crucial about Comer. So he lasts through the Kennedy administration and the Johnson administration, ends up becoming Johnson's kind of main civilian guy in South Vietnam. And his reputation is tarnished, to say the least, because he kind of famously is always giving these sunny reports about progress up to and then even after the Tet Offensive in 1968. So he becomes a kind of laughingstock. Although he does actually return, he stays in national security circles. He kind of comes back post Nixon, and he is Byron Engel's greatest supporter. He believes in police assistance as a mission. He trusts Byron Engel, and I have this great memo that I refer to in the book where Engel kind of like hears through the grapevine that there's going to be a big shakeup in South Vietnam. This ultimately is what leads to the creation of CORDS, which Comer will oversee. So Engel hears through the grapevine there's going to be a shakeup of civilian operations, which is going to, he believes, deeply affect the Office of Public Safety's operations there. So he writes to Comer in this kind of formal tone. I mean, I think they're the kind of people who are on first name basis, who are in touch frequently, but he writes this somewhat formal memo and basically says, like, please, in this shakeup, to the extent that you can have an effect, please protect the Office of Public Safety. I'm really worried. And Comer writes him back and says, Byron, like, don't worry. the shakeup is my idea. I'm going to be in charge of it. And the whole idea behind it is to protect these civilian security operations that the Office of Public Safety is doing. I mean, I'm not quoting verbatim, but that's basically the point. So they have this relationship where Comer protects police assistants. I mean, on the one hand, he strengthens police assistants because he's able to maneuver through and muddle through these bureaucratic battles. When the other folks get sidelined, police assistance becomes the main tool, or one of the main tools, and then he's able to devote resources to the Office of Public Safety, protect Engel. Engel is popular among public safety advisors, although not all of them. Some of them actually don't like him, but Engel isn't necessarily popular with the Agency for International Development leadership. He isn't necessarily somebody who, can get, Johnson on the phone, whereas Comer can, right? So that really matters for the ultimate kind of longevity of the Office of Public Safety. And it just bears mentioning that when the Nixon administration comes into office, the Engel and the Office of Public Safety really have to kind of figure out how to keep going. And at first they do a decent job because they say, what are the Nixon administration's priorities? Whatever they are, we can adhere to them. It turns out that that's narcotics control, and Engel says, oh, narcotics control. In 1955 or whatever, I was working in narcotics control in Turkey, which is true. He's like, I'm your guy, Nixon administration, trust me. But there are a number of other reasons that the Office of Public Safety can't survive. But it's worth mentioning that with Comer out of the picture, there is nobody kind of at that level of the National Security Council who has access to the White House, who can protect OPS when scandals arise and budget cuts emerge and so on and so forth.
So, and it's a great point you make about Comer's ability to manage the transition here from Kennedy to Johnson, and to be appreciated by both and the respect of both. And one of the others, although it's a bit more tenuous, is his main ideological political ally is Walter Rostow, who's economic historian out of MIT, deputy national security advisor under Kennedy, and then becomes Johnson's national security advisor. And so not only is Rostow one of the leading modernization theorists, and he's architect of the Vietnam War. There's some who argue that in the last year of the Kennedy administration, that he was on the outs with Kennedy, that Kennedy was no longer responding to his memos, that he was pushing for the hard line. He finds that support with Johnson. Obviously, he and Comer share a view. You have this, I think, this amazing memo from Rostow to Johnson, where he makes this connection. I mean, this is, the book itself could just be written on this memo, between law and order at home and counterinsurgency abroad. Yeah. And it's so telling. And the fact that he's using that phrase, the law and order phrase that becomes obviously Nixon's baby, and then
sure.
Onward. Can you talk a little about that memo? And I'm also curious, what was your reaction when you found it? Which is also, I think, just one of these, you envision it, and then its broader implications.
Yeah. So I think if I remember correctly, I actually discovered a reference to that memo in a dissertation by Tracy Tullis, who actually went to NYU, and that dissertation really was the kind of the one piece of writing that I think I knew about it before I began grad school, and I can't really figure out how I knew about it. I mean, it might have been that I had seen a citation of it, and when I got to graduate school and I got library access through ProQuest, that was literally the first thing that dissertation was the first thing I downloaded on ProQuest. So again, I had, as we talked about earlier, I'd applied with this different project idea, but I knew that there was some. So the Tullis dissertation is I think the title is a Vietnam at Home. So she and again, like she was working with Robin Kelly. I think that my advisor Nikhil Singh, they had some contact. So, and also Nicole Siegel, who is somebody who I've worked quite closely with, and whose book also talks about the Office of Public Safety. She also went to NYU around this period. So there's some intimate connections, even though the time span is a bit elongated. But anyway. So she cited this memo, but yeah, of course, I went to the Johnson Library and I pulled it for myself. And yeah, it's a really remarkable document. It has an interesting tone because it's really about, on some level, kind of domestic Democratic Party politics, as I recall. But he's really, he says to Johnson, it's during Johnson, not Kennedy, as I recall. He says, look, I saw your speech last night on television. It was a great speech. And here is my kind of analysis of the issues facing your administration and how to, kind of bolster your ratings. You need to think about the law and order problem and the communist insurgency problem as the same problem. So, I happen to, on some level, agree with what Rostow is saying from a kind of, position of critique, which is to say that, like, it is actually true that was how these two problems were being framed by policymakers. In other words, Rostow says it quite clearly. He's not inventing anything new. This is already the case, right? He just puts it in a very explicit way. So, one of the other pieces that I discovered as far as Rostow goes is that, we think of him as this intellectual whose designs for modernization really shape U.S. policy. They shape some of the, utter fiasco of the U.S. war in Vietnam. But when you look in the archives, you find, I think, a less clear, and of course, intellectual historians have said this, but you find a less clear kind of direction of influence from, like, Rostow's big brain to policy implementation. Now, that's not necessarily surprising. The surprising thing that I found was that when you look at people like Comer, they are influencing what we tend to read in the intellectual histories as the ideas in Rostow's big brain, right? So Comer, Rostow gives this famous talk at Fort Bragg, which is about guerrilla warfare. It's where he, kind of uses this somewhat indelible phrase about how communists are scavengers of the modernization process, meaning that, modernization does unsettle existing societies. There are two things that can happen as a result. The U.S. can take advantage of that and push the kind of ferment in the direction of, capitalism, democracy, blah, blah, blah. Or the U.S. Can stand by and watch the communists take advantage of that ferment and use it for their own purposes. So that speech is famous and widely quoted by people kind of in many different subfields of history. Well, it turns out that a draft of it went to Comer, and Comer gave him some edits, right? So this is something that I think is for me was important to discover, and I think kind of reframed a little bit of how I was thinking about the kind of intellectual history. And I think I made a bigger deal out of that in some drafts of the book as I was writing it than in others. And the kind of final version maybe doesn't make a huge deal out of it, but it's really important, I think, I think a lot of intellectual historians would say that the greatest challenge is showing the kind of from policy to intellectual from policy to monograph, and then from monograph back to policy, like showing how those relationships unfold is really hard. But I think that the tools are there, and it just kind of goes back to my fundamental premise, which is, as we talked about earlier, which is just kind of reading the archive in a slightly different way, and looking for different types of relationships and different types of processes than I think historians have been accustomed to look for. Now, again, it's not to say that I'm inventing something totally new. Like I said, that this very important memo for my study, I'm not by any means the first person to have quoted it, but it's like, to me, I took Rostow's framing of the problem as true, and and then tried to develop a method of analysis that would be adequate to that, right? And so that was really that was my impetus, and it just, I tried to have it suffuse everything I do within the text.
Well, and that, it where it also connects is when we think about kind of applications. And so there's the idea of also unintended consequences that runs through. So we think about, for example, we've talked about it a little bit already, but tear gas, right? Or CS. And it's one of my favorite chapters where what you call the imperial circuit of tear gas, and how it was developed and deployment. And part of this is, these recommendations from the Kerner Commission report that you touch on how do you deal with civil disorder. And then tear gas itself, as you talk about, bridges counterinsurgency abroad and then policing at home. Can you talk about that for a bit?
Absolutely. I think, if I'm not mistaken, today is the 50th anniversary of the dropping of tear gas from a helicopter onto the prison yard at Attica. A helicopter flying over a prison and dousing a bunch of people who are outdoors with CS or another chemical. This is a direct importation from the techniques used by the United States to fight the war in South Vietnam. So what I show in this chapter is that the United States military and then ultimately the ARVN come to use CS, which is a kind of super tear gas. That's what they call it. Use it in massive quantities during the war. They use it under the kind of principle that guerrillas in the kind of jungles and forests, and then also bunkers and tunnels and caves and so forth, they're just really hard to find. This is the fundamental problem of guerrilla warfare, or of counter guerrilla warfare. It's hard to find the guerrillas, right? If the soldiers shoot tear gas into the spaces where they believe there might be hiding guerrillas, they will flee because they can't breathe. And when they flee, they can be arrested or they can be shot. So when the United States first starts trying to use this chemical weapon, it becomes a scandal, an international scandal. And it's absolutely, the North Vietnam and National Liberation Front and journalists who have connections to the international communist movement, that they are getting the word out internationally that the United States is using this new chemical. This is early in Johnson's presidency. So the Secretary of State, Rusk, the Secretary of Defense, McNamara, and the president himself are all compelled to comment. And they're forced to comment because they need to make clear to the international public that tear gas is not a banned chemical weapon. Now, the United States is also using defoliants, as we well know, Agent Orange and others. But the initial scandal about chemical weapons is actually about CS. And what do they say? They say, Johnson himself, he has this line where he says, they all say, look, this is not a problem. This is what cops use in riot situations in the United States for crowd control. Johnson says, something along the lines of like, if the Negroes came into the White House tomorrow, we would use tear gas to get rid of them. So it's like I read that, or and I was just like, okay. On some level, my analysis is already laid out in these documentary records. But the interesting thing was that it wasn't true. It just wasn't true. Police in the United States did not have access to CS. They had access to CN, which is another chemical that has similar properties, but is not really just not as intense as CS. Now, in 2020, when police used tear gas in more than 100 cities during the uprisings after George Floyd's murder, they were using CS, right? So CS becomes the chemical weapon of choice used by police. Johnson administration says, don't worry about us using it in South Vietnam. It's what police use, but that isn't true. It only becomes true after 1967, 1968, when Byron Engel says to the Kerner Commission, we've had great experience using chemical weapons in crowd and riot control overseas with the Office of Public Safety. I recommend that police use this tool. And so CS, which is now being used in South Vietnam, becomes the tear gas of choice among law enforcement. So even in April 1968, in the uprisings after King is assassinated, police are already using CS. They had not been using it before that. And in fact, they hadn't really been using tear gas all that much. I mean, of course, tear gas was used, but it was not used to the level that it was used after the Kerner Commission report, and then after the LEAA funds the purchase of CS across the country. And I have this statistic which I gathered from a kind of U.S. Army, I think, history text, which the U.S. Army produces these incredibly detailed, very useful, and actually often quite well written histories. And just in there's this stat that is something like, during the uprising in Newark in 1967, the National Guard, shoots, I can't remember the number, but like 8,000 bullets and no tear gas. And then in April of 1968, the National Guard, shoots something like 10 bullets instead of thousands. But then uses, thousands of tear gas grenades, right? So the shift, and this goes back to our conversation about the Kerner Commission and this implementation of some of these suppression of disorder recommendations that start to get implemented, at the end of 67 into 68, so they're already implemented by April of 1968, even though in April of 1968, the kind of social welfare recommendations of the Kerner Commission have already been, dead on arrival. So yeah, I spent some time on all of this circulation, what I call the imperial circuit of tear gas. And I think it's just like one of these examples of how U.S. empire really deserves to be analyzed in kind of both foreign and domestic perspective. People, technologies, ideas, all are traveling across borders. And it's not to say that this is the only way to study policing, but I do think it's really worth putting some thought every time we historians or other scholars, analyze not just policing, but many other aspects of U.S. policy. Like, is there a kind of foreign policy dimension that we should be taking into account? Now, there may not be, but if we haven't asked ourselves that question at the outset, I worry that we might be missing something. And so I think that's kind of, if there is a takeaway from my book that I would hope people would take, which is, aside from the kind of empirical or theoretical or methodological dimensions, it's really just to kind of pause and say, when we do our analysis, is the object that I'm studying actually contained by the borders of the nation state, or is it, purely outside the borders of the nation state? Is it purely overseas? And I think we should ask ourselves whether it is, and maybe it is, but I would wager that it's likely not.
Well, that's a great way to bring this to a close. I think this is really a fascinating book, a fascinating discussion. I can't thank you enough. I could talk to you for 3 more hours, Stuart. So this is
well, maybe we can do it another time in person. But I really appreciate this conversation. It's really great, and I thank you so much for your close attention to my book.
No, it's my pleasure, honestly. And we barely scratched the surface. So it's such a. I want to hold up the book cover. It's a wonderful book cover too, by the way. I love it.
Thanks.
Congratulations, Stuart Schrader. Badges Without Borders, How Global Counterinsurgency Transformed American Policing. It's an amazing, wonderful book. Can't thank you enough for writing it and all the your wonderful thoughts on the book and on America as an empire and as a policing empire. But thank you again for doing this, and hopefully we'll get a chance to meet in person or to bring you after the pandemic, bring you up here to give a talk to students here. So. Thanks again.
Thanks very much.
Hopefully we'll see you again soon.